Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last class, we talked about the peculiar institution of slavery. Today, we're going to return to that topic and focus on how slaves actually lived and built a slave society and what life was like under slavery. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's APUSH. History class rides again! We have three objectives today. By the end of this class today, you should be able to identify the legal and material constraints on slaves' lives and work. You should be able to explain how distinct slave cultures emerged in the Old South, and you should be able to describe major forms of resistance to the practice of slavery. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 18. Slaves were considered property and had very few legal rights. They weren't allowed to have, the legal rights were limited to things like they couldn't testify in court against a white person. Certainly slaves couldn't carry a firearm. They couldn't leave plantations without permission. They also couldn't read or write. And even just simple things like gathering, they couldn't gather in a group without the white person serving as a chaperone to be present. Masters controlled whether slaves got married and how they spent their free time. This system of maintaining order was entirely borne out by force. There were a lot of tools that a master had to keep order, including whipping or exploiting divisions among the slaves, incentives for behavior, or by the constant threat of sale to just go be shipped off to a new life in some other plantation. The conditions of slave life, then, I think you can imagine are pretty dire. American slaves, as compared to their counterparts in the West Indies and Brazil, still actually had some advantages over some of their South American counterparts. Not that I'm excusing slavery, but let's put it in its context. They enjoyed things like better diets and lower infant mortality, and did live longer life expectancies. These reasons would include the lack of malaria and yellow fever through much of the South, and then the high cost of slaves. Because slaves couldn't be constantly re-imported from Africa, they made the slaves that were there rarer and more expensive. And so it just becomes a more valuable commodity to the slave owner. Improvements in slaves' living conditions were actually meant to strengthen the practice of slavery, though, not to undermine it. If we say that there's better slave treatment in America than what exists in Brazil, that doesn't mean that, slavery's better in America, and if it actually just goes and reinforces and keeps the practice going on longer. I think in no way can we say that slavery is a good thing. Subpoint C. By the year 1860, there was nearly 500,000 free black people in the United States, most of whom lived in the South. Free black people weren't still all that free. Just because a person wasn't in a condition of slavery doesn't mean that they were living a life of freedom. Free black people were allowed by law to own property and were allowed to marry, and they couldn't be bought or sold. But free black people had no voice in selecting public officials, and they also couldn't testify in courts and certainly couldn't serve on a jury. In cities of New Orleans and Charleston, relatively prosperous free black communities developed, but the majority of free black people lived in the Upper South, in Maryland and Virginia. There they worked for wages as farm laborers in rural areas. But let's return to that topic of slave labor. Labor occupied most of a slave's daily existence, whether as a butler or a cook or a coachman or a nurse. Slaves also served as waitresses, dairymaids, gardeners, carpenters, shoemakers, engineers, blacksmiths, weavers, and whatever it was always about the work. Most slaves, though, they worked in the fields. It's estimated that 75% of the women and 90% of the men worked as field hands. On large plantations, they worked in gangs under the direction of an overseer. The overseer was a man who was considered cruel by most slaves. Some of the harshest conditions were in Louisiana, specifically in the sugar fields. There was also tough times in the rice plantations of South Carolina and Georgia. There, though, they used a colonial-era task system, and because white people feared the malaria-infested swamps, and so the less time that you could fill in that time, the better. Subpoint E. There was also slaves in urban areas, and some, maybe 200,000 slaves worked in the ironworks and tobacco factories of the Upper South. Here, most city slaves would be servants and cooks and domestic workers. Some city slaves were even skilled artisans, and occasionally, not often, but some notable exceptions, even lived on their own and appeared to be independent workers while they were actually serving in a condition of servitude and slavery. Roman numeral number next. Number 19. Slaves never abandoned their desire for freedom, no matter what kind of treatment or condition they got. There was never this acceptance that slavery was going to be okay. They never broke their determination to resist bondage. Within that desire, though, a slave culture developed, shaped by African traditions, but also American values and experiences. Despite the threat of constant sale and the fact that marriage between slaves was illegal in most places, many slaves did marry and create families. Slaves frequently named their children after family members. It was one of the only ways to really preserve family continuity. The slave community had significantly higher numbers of female-headed households as compared to the white community, and I think that really shows the instability of slave life. In some states, maybe 1 in 3 slave marriages would be broken up by sale. Children were separated from their families, and traders, considering slaves to be commodity properties, paid no attention to family ties. Subpoint B. Black Christianity grew up a little bit differently than white Christianity. It was distinctive. And I think that one of the distinctions was its constant promise of hope to the enslaved people. Almost every plantation had a black preacher whose job it was to proclaim the gospel to the slaves. And slaves worshipped in biracial churches. So there would be churches that would serve white congregations and black congregations, and maybe even at the same time. The free black people would establish their own churches that would not be intermixed with white society. The masters usually required services with white ministers who emphasized obedience. So if there might be black preachers on the plantation, formal church services, often white ministers would do that, and there it would emphasize the understanding of obedience under the law. Still, slaves viewed Christianity through the lens of the slave, and stories like the Exodus was a central role in black Christianity. No surprise there. Jesus Christ was understood as a personal redeemer coming individually for people, and the Christian message of brotherhood seemed like it was a real indictment of the practice of slavery. Subpoint C. Slave folklore would glorify the weak over the strong, and their songs became known as Negro spirituals. They were constantly emphasizing the eventual liberation that would come at, whether actual liberation from slavery or the spiritual liberation of going towards heaven. All slaves saw the injustice of slavery. I'm not sure that anybody serving in the system could think that it was just at all. And the current thoughts unleashed by American Revolution, the rhetoric of freedom heard around them, it only strengthened their desire to participate in that same American freedom. Slaves used networking, and thus they knew about political events and the activities of abolitionists, which will be a topic in a future class. Roman numeral number 7. Because slaves were outnumbered, slave rebellions were pretty rare, but there were other forms of resistance that existed. Most commonly, things like silent sabotage, breaking tools and abusing animals and just doing crappy work. More commonly, though, less commonly, there were more serious forms of resistance, including attempted poisonings of the master and arson and a few armed revolts. They weren't super common, but when they happened, they were certainly alarming to white culture. More threatening to the slave system was simply running away and escaping. Of the estimated 1,000 slaves a year to escape, most of them were from the Upper South. And there's no surprise here to me, the slaves in Maryland and Virginia, who are closest to the free states, would have the easiest shot at escape. In the Deep South, fugitive slaves often just tried to escape to cities and there blend in with the free black population that existed. The Underground Railroad was a loose organization of abolitionists who helped slaves escape. The Underground Railroad wasn't an actual railroad, of course, but it was a network of white and black sympathizers who would provide secret passages and secret paths and nighttime escapes for anybody that could think they could make the challenge. The most famous of these members of the Underground Railroad, the conductors, was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was an escaped Maryland slave who in the 1850s rescued many others. She made somewhere around 20 trips back and forth to go make these daring escapes for slaves. Subpoint B. Here I want to introduce a new figure named Denmark Vesey. His first name is Denmark, in Charleston, South Carolina. In 1820, Charleston, South Carolina had a free black population of 1,500 people and a lot of African American institutions, including fellowship societies and an active AME church. In 1822, Denmark Vesey was a free black man, and he was charged with organizing a slave revolt there in Charleston. The conspiracy was uncovered before Vesey could act. He had been antagonizing white people over the hypocrisy of things like the Declaration of Independence. And Denmark Vesey was a religious man. He believed that the Bible condemned slavery. Now, historians generally accept the truth that Denmark Vesey was rousing rabble among the black population. But there's also some compelling evidence that claims the plot was entirely made up by some fearful slave owners who just needed to get Denmark Vesey out of the way. He was hanged along with 34 alleged co-conspirators, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where they allegedly planned the rebellion, was burned down to the ground. Denmark Vesey never actually pulled off the rebellion. He planned it probably, but never actually committed the crime of which he was executed for there. Subpoint C. There was another rebellion that's worth noting, and that's Nat Turner's rebellion, the Turner Rebellion in Virginia. Nat Turner was a slave. Unlike Denmark Vesey, who was a free black man, Nat Turner was a slave in Southampton County, Virginia. He was a religious mystic and believed that he saw visions of God and that God spoke to him. He believed that God had specifically chosen him to go lead an uprising. And he had a vision where he believed that Jesus had told him that Jesus had laid down the yoke that he had borne for men, and that Turner should take it on and fight against the serpent, for the time was fast approaching when the first would be last and the last would be first. Turner believed that God was telling him to go break the bonds of slavery and preparing for the second coming of Jesus. Believing the solar eclipse in August of 1831 was the omen that he was waiting for, Turner and a handful of others marched through Virginia, attacking white farm families, killing 55 men, women, and children. Turner hoped that hundreds of slaves would come out to come join his rebellion. 80 actually did before the militia put down the rebellion, and honestly put it down pretty easily. Turner was captured and executed, and the counter-rebellion against the people that would have joined Nat Turner or sympathizers killed 40 more black people in 2 days, putting 15 of those people's heads on pikes and scattering them around the town as a warning to others as what happens if you try to leave a slave rebellion. Nat Turner's rebellion was the last significant slave rebellion in the South. Turner's rebellion sent shockwaves throughout the South. The Virginia legislature debated plans for the gradual emancipation of slaves and a method to make a slave colony abroad, but the bill failed. But basically it was a feeling like the old system isn't working anymore. We got to figure out some new approach. The prospect that planters would end slavery on their own, those days were past. Instead, Virginia reacted by tightening its grip on slavery through new laws which were designed to further limit slaves' rights. 1831 was a turning point for the Old South. White Southerners closed ranks to defend slavery more than ever. Dissenting opinions were suppressed, and some states criminalized membership in abolitionist clubs. Just joining a membership could get you thrown in jail. Subpoint D, I want to end this episode on a question of the Amistad, because in 1839, 53 slaves took control of a slave ship in the Caribbean known as the Amistad, and they tried to force the navigator to turn around and sail back across the Atlantic back to Africa. The Amistad turned northward and it sailed up the American coast, and there it was intercepted by a United States ship and seized. Martin Van Buren was the sitting president. He tried to return the ship and slaves back to their charter in Cuba, but abolitionists brought the case to the Supreme Court. And saying that, like, hey, this was intercepted in American waters and this is importation of slaves and that's illegal, so we ought to get these slaves set free. Former President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, goes and argues on behalf of the slaves all the way up to the Supreme Court. He says since the slaves were captured in violation of international treaties banning the slave trade, then these people should be free. They were free back at home and should be free here. The Supreme Court agreed, and most of them made their way back to Africa. The case might have inspired similar uprisings in 1841 of Virginia slaves who took over the ship known as the Creole, and then they headed towards the Bahamas, where there, entering British waters, the British granted them freedom. This question of slavery and how it's going to be carried out and how slaves live in their conditions and how white people are going to react to slavery, well, this is the story of the rest of American history, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.